So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Just to explain a little bit about the thinking behind this event before we get going. Actually, I think it originally came from an idea from James, but very enthusiastically received by the CRASSH team, was to have some way of past network conveners to convey something of their experience, but also what their network had led on to afterwards. In a way that might be useful and encouraging to those of you who are leading networks at the moment, and also those of you who might be thinking of applying to run a CRASSH research network. So very grateful that three speakers who are ex-conveners of CRASSH research networks have been willing to come and share their experiences with us today. I'm going to ask them a series of questions really to get at their motivation, how they found the experience of setting up a research network, and then also what it might have led to them, to afterwards for them, the way in which they might have developed on those collaborations and network sense. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves first, just say who they are and also what network they ran and when it ran. So James, could I start with you?
Yeah, of course, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Esther and Judith for setting this event up, and it's nice to see everyone here today. My name's James Riley. I'm Fellow of English at Girton College. I'm also a postgraduate tutor there, and I previously ran, or co-ran, one of the research networks here at CRASSH. I ran it with my friend and colleague Yvonne Salmon, who's an artist and writer and practicing academic here at Cambridge. And the group that we ran was called the Alchemical Landscape, and we ran it from here at CRASSH from 2016 to 2019. So we had 3 iterations under the CRASSH banner and the Research Network banner. We applied for that going into 2016, and we also reapplied for each subsequent year, thinking carefully about what we actually wanted to do. And our time at CRASSH also came out of it was a sort of extension of what we'd also been running under the Alchemical Landscape banner overall. We'd run 2 conferences, sort of day-long symposia prior to that. We'd also run a series of other events connected to that banner, and we had the Alchemical Landscape in mind as this collaborative, multi-platform research project. So that our time here at CRASSH was sort of one planned phase of that project. And in short, the Alchemical Landscape was this attempt to think through and to understand from an academic and a critical and also a practice-led perspective the connection in contemporary culture, broadly speaking, between magic and landscape. We were interested in what we referred to as the geographical turn, the way in which a wide range of contemporary artists, filmmakers, writers, other practitioners were thinking through a relationship with landscape in a very overtly occultural or spiritualized manner, using a lot of language that pertain to the supernatural, the paranormal, the fantastical. This was also the time of films like Ben Wheatley's Field of England. It was the 2012 Olympic Games, which was playing quite heavily with sort of Blakean ideas of the English pastoral and sort of bucolic imagery. We also thought it was a way to understand one's engagement with landscape, the national identity. Places like Jessbeth was Jerusalem were key to that, with all the way in which that links to mythology, plus a certain critical recapitulation of certain films and ideas from the 1970s, like Pender's Fen. All this was in the air when we were putting this idea together, and we essentially wanted to use the project to try and understand that cultural moment. But we were also effectively working as practicing artists during that time as well. So we were doing lots of projects, field visits, like specificity work, that kind of thing. So when our time here at CRASSH was to sort of work through that project within the kind of platforms that the Research Network made available, regular seminars, regular events, that kind of thing.
Thank you. Great. Shafiq.
Hi, I'm Shafiq Ahmed. I'm the Research Coordinator at the university's Energy Interdisciplinary Research Centre. So I run a CRASSH network from 2015 to 2019, and it was focused on looking at in search of good energy policy. So looking at issues around energy policy, not just from a technology point of view, but from a social science, social norms, ethics, law, and other disciplines. So we ran this the network was led by Professor Michael Pollitt, who's a professor of business economics at the Judge Business School, and we really wanted to explore these issues, looking at the interdisciplinary nature of how energy policy is made, and we ran a series of seminars through CRASSH, inviting expert speakers from one discipline with a respondent from a different discipline critiquing that topic and the subject. And it really raised a lot of interesting discussions, just juxtaposing topics such as theology with engineering, and really trying to understand all the sort of nuances that are sometimes missing from the debate. So I think I think we'll go on to the successes, but I think running a CRASSH network was really instrumental in building that cross-disciplinary cohort of researchers and teasing out some of these nuances that wouldn't happen elsewhere.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Do come in and find a seat where you can. I think there's a few over here. Thank you. So Mesna, over to you.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I was a co-convener of a research network called Archives of the Disappeared, Discipline and Method of Mensroom, that ran from 2019 to 2022. I was co-convener alongside Professor Yael Navarro, Hannah Morgenstern, and Mavish Ahmed. Each of us are in a different faculty. I'm in history, Yael Navarro is in anthropology, Yael Navarro, yes, in anthropology, Hannah Morgenstern in English, and Mavish Ahmed, who's based at LSE in sociology. And our research network actually started earlier, a few years before we got support from CRASSH, as a conversation amongst friends about a methodological problem we were all contending with, which was we are all, in one way or another, scholars of mass violence, eliminationist violence of one form or another, and are concerned around certain kind of methodological gaps in our disciplines and in conversations around how to do the work that we do in the places we work, in particular in the Middle East and South Asia. And so we sort of, we're having this ongoing conversation, and what happened was that our application and our participation as a research network at CRASSH rapidly catalyzed our thinking and our organizing and our work in really kind of generative ways, and produced a kind of 3 years of thinking about what a different kind of methodology within our own disciplines and across disciplines can do and can work with and must contend with when it comes to the question of recovery and retrieval of eliminated worlds, communities, societies, histories, life worlds, and literatures. And so we asked sets of questions around what is left, what happens when nothing is left behind, and how do we think about questions of accountability and justice. And we were taking this up along both disciplinary lines, but also in terms of practice. So the research network was really bound up with questions that we share with artists and archivists, with climate scientists as well, and we sort of organized the network was quite cumulative from one year to another. So our first year was heavily a reading year, alongside an increasing cohort of fellow scholars, students, etc. where we read thematically across multiple literatures and really kind of grappled with and did close and deep reads of that literature. We also became very involved in questions in Cambridge around recovery and retrieval and new narratives, in particularly legacies of enslavement inquiries at the university were something we thought through and lived in our research network. And I'll leave it up to that.
Thank you very much. So my next question is, we're occasionally approached by people at CRASSH who are very interested in applying for a research network. They've got a theme that they want to study, but actually they don't yet have many contacts beyond their own departments. Now, for many of you, it sounds as though the CRASSH network actually grew out of an existing collaboration. But could you think back to before that collaboration started? How did you start contacting people? How did you find those links with potential co-conveners from other departments? James, do you want to go?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was the pre-existence of it did come out of an existing collaboration with myself and Avon Evie Salmon. She's very much the director of the Alchemical Landscape Programme overall, but we also had a variety of other contacts across the university. We've been involved in another group in which Evie was also in a kind of directorial role, called the Counterculture Research Group, which was a slightly more specific in its remit, but that had got us contacts in a variety of different departments. We saw it very much as a bridge between Faculty of English and Literary Studies and Law and Land Economy. That was our kind of shared disciplinary focus. And I think in terms of the reaching out to other individuals, we were trying to think about the methodological and theoretical problems that we actually wanted to solve, and we wanted to actually respond to. And part of the thing that we were actually interested in terms of the group was developing a kind of critical language to talk about the cultural products that we were analysing, that we were interested in, and that we really thought that they existed in a very potent and powerful grey area between a lot of disciplines, that you needed to actually understand various elements of landscape and the way in which that works and the actual ground of it, as well as the emergent products. So in terms of us, we already had that close bridge and that close practical bridge already. But in terms of reaching out to other people, it was led by the questions that we actually wanted to engage with, and it was a case of working with our existing contacts, but putting feelers out to people who we thought would actually be interested and actually opening up the conversation. In terms of our actual CRASSH being hosted at CRASSH and working at CRASSH, that it did come out of, as I indicated earlier, 2 conferences, 2 symposia. We'd done one in 2015 and we'd done another one the year after in 2016, the summer that led up to us coming to CRASSH, which were obviously very rewarding events to get a lot of people together. And we opened those out deliberately as broad as we possibly could in terms of the interdisciplinary focus, getting practitioners and artists there, getting critics and writers and theorists and academics. And part of that was to actually, have the conversation that we wanted to have, but also from a slightly more mercenary perspective, it was kind of, auditioning was probably the wrong term, but it was a case of we want to actually meet people who we might want to be working with in the future. We actually wanted to survey the field, not just theoretically, but also from on a kind of personal and professional level. So we were flinging the doors open quite wide and using those events from the academic perspective, but effectively for kind of a networking perspective. And we used those contacts going forward when we then began to think about, well, how could the project actually work within the confines of CRASSH? We were drawing specifically on those contacts that we had made there.
Yeah, that's something we see actually quite a lot at CRASSH, that a one-off event can lead to a research network, and vice versa. It's not a one-way street. But often people are using one to create a kind of network of contacts of people who are really interested in a theme from different perspectives, and then they can move on to something else. But for you, it sounds like at the beginning it really started from you participating in an interdisciplinary group, and that's when you found your initial contacts.
Participating in it, and also I think that what gave it a certain degree of sharpness, and I think what gave it a sort of a focus was we were very clear about the kind of material that we wanted to work with, and effectively the type of material that we were critically engaging with, and we were very clear about what we actually wanted to, in some ways, kind of achieve from it, in the sense that we wanted the dissemination of knowledge, we wanted to actually get more information about the material that we're interested in. We saw it as a kind of public research, and this is the way in which we are doing our research in this particular form. But we were very clear that we wanted to try to define a kind of discourse for this. That's to say, the reason for it existing was that we didn't really feel that there was the necessary critical toolkit to talk about these works, and that's what it was meant to be doing. So there was an openness and a wideness and a participatory element to it, but there was a sort of rationale and a strategy underpinning that. There's a real mission in terms of what we actually wanted it to achieve. It was not the kind of, weekly club which would go on, for who knows how long. It was a device, an instrument in some way, which had a very clear set of parameters.
Great, thank you. Shafiq, tell us where everything started for you.
So
how did you contact
the
people?
idea was an initial discussion between the Energy IRC, or Strategic Research Initiative at the time, the Judge Business School, and the Centre for Science and Policy, so Rob Doubleday was one of the co-conveners. And between us, we had very good initial links with to particular departments. But between us and sort of brainstorming, we widened that co-convener group to, I think, around 20 co-conveners across a much wider spread. And from the start, we wanted the event to be also outward facing, so we didn't just want an academic discussion amongst ourselves. We proactively wanted to engage with speakers from other universities, other sectors, from industry, from government, and so we also built in some time during the night to have this sort of ideas generation, where anyone amongst the group could suggest speakers, could suggest topics, and that also led to some areas that we wouldn't initially have focused on. And we also organised a number of workshops. So we had one on faith, energy, and society, and again that similar to that highlighted some certain speakers that we thought, that would be interesting to invite and explore some of these areas in more detail. And I think all these crash networks, they are sort of an evolving organic beast. So maybe what we envisaged is not sort of how it sort of ends up. And I think having that sort of flexibility is vital and key as well. So it sort of, as our network lasted over 4 years, it did evolve and lead to areas which we hadn't planned. And I think that's the beauty of these networks, that it's not sort of prescriptive. So feel free to sort of explore and allow speakers which you wouldn't necessarily have thought of, and having that platform and space to discuss is really vital.
Can I ask, just as a follow-up, so CRASSH asked you to have 2 co-conveners from different departments. You had 20.
So
how did that happen? How did that work?
I think the idea was not all the co-conveners could attend every single seminar or every single meeting, but having access to those people with themselves having wide networks allowed us again to pick their brains, as it were. So, like I say, for us it worked having a much broader scope, because we really wanted to get away from just the traditional science, technology, and engineering disciplines to really look at much more varied discussions around the ethics of energy, the human rights of energy, the theological aspects of energy as a sort of a resource for humanity. So really, the interesting discussions which are at the interfaces of these disciplines. And as we see with the COP meetings, it is really important that we bring together all these voices that aren't necessarily heard into the room, and we allow all these interesting discussions to take place and inform each other. And I think that's what was really interesting to see, how research was informed by discussions that we had and sort of introductions that were made, and how that also then led on to further collaborations.
Yeah.
So really we saw this as a springboard to develop new areas of research and new activities.
Yeah, great, thank you. Mesli, can you tell us how everything started for you? How did you make those initial contacts that allowed you to put the network on?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember back, and I think the key germination for the conversation, but also for us coming together, was really student and faculty organizing around themes around the university outside of faculty. So all of us were in some way or other involved in Zero Carbon Cambridge, Defend Education Cambridge, and Zero Carbon, and Demilitarize Cambridge. Efforts that were about thinking of Cambridge as an institution, and some of the organizing around those kinds of issues. But also we were part of an earlier effort, but all of us kind of on the outer, not in the core team of a seminar we called the Critical Theory Seminar, which ran for about 3 or 4 years and was also a university-wide effort outside of the sort of structure of different faculty research seminars that was, inviting all sorts of people to come and give talks and lectures and readings. And I think we found each other often asking similar questions in all of these spaces that were about edge conditions, that were about places and societies that were often regarded in the conversation as edge conditions, but we regarded as actually central conditions. And, so we were kind of the catastrophists in the room, often, who are like, well, what happens if this happens? And so there was this shared camaraderie that we often found ourselves with afterwards. So it was partly that. It was partly these conversations that developed really slowly around seeing in each other, hey, she keeps asking the same questions I was thinking about. And then a little bit later on, it was similar to, I think, James, and that we organized a few, we were like, well, let's have a couple of events. Really actually to test each other and see, can we work together? Do we get along? And we became very good friends in that process, but also that we learned we can work together. We have enough of a shared sensibility, we have different skill sets, we come from different disciplines, but ones that share similar problems. So it was a slow process. We're quite methodical, and then COVID smacked us, but it also created this incredible opportunity. We can talk about that later, but it's that sort of slow germination.
It's very interesting, actually, a connection between what a few of you are saying about effectively trying people out or auditioning people, working with them in a small way to see whether actually this could be a longer term collaboration.
Yeah.
Because as you say, it's not enough just that you have a kind of shared intellectual interest. You also have to really enjoy working together. And that's an important part of setting up a network, I think.
Yeah, because then otherwise the not being able to work together will prevent you from thinking together.
Yeah.
And it just becomes a really bothersome, boring, task rather than the sort of generative space that you want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was in a sense about the setting up of the network and the prior process to that. I want to take you back now to the actual experience of leading the network, which for a number of you went on over multiple years. I'm going to talk later about the afterlife, but if you can think just about the experience of leading the network, what benefits do you think it brought in that moment for you as co-conveners, but also for the wider community? Shafiq, should we start with you this time?
I think having a neutral space was really important because we're all in our own faculties and departments spread across Cambridge, was having a central neutral space where you bring everyone together, plus members of the public and anyone. It was open to anyone really. Sort of allowed people to then maybe be more open-minded and not maybe just think of these discussions and issues from their own disciplinary perspective. And I think that's really key. And having also free lunch would also be really good to get people to attend.
So everyone take notes.
Coffee afterwards as well for the post discussion. And we held these seminars during lunchtime, which we felt was the best time because any other time, would clash with teaching and other commitments. So it was so people did come in sort of like a mindset, and having all that support from CRASSH was really key as well, because I think having sort of centralised sort of advertising and having all the details of seminars online really again reached a different community and a wider community than you might have otherwise. And I think the structure, like I say, we had it was a 1 hour seminar with usually a main speaker who would talk for say 20-25 minutes, and then a respondent who would critique the speaker and the topics for about 10-15 minutes. But we wanted to really allow as much time for the Q&A, which was where most of the sort of interesting discussion came from. So having space for that was really key. And then following up with the networking. And having a regular slot in people's diaries was also useful, so that people just knew, okay, that's the CRASSH day, so people would have that already in their diary. And also that created a sort of cohort feeling, because we have often the same or very similar groups coming, so that was also a way of building networks, collaborations, building relationships, meeting each other, and as I said, one of the things that the network allows is building a key sort of understanding of the language that people use, because again, words really depend on the context, and people might have different understandings of key terms from science and social science. So again, building up that sort of common knowledge base to then allow those discussions is really key, and that takes again time to establish and understand what do you really mean by that, and have you thought about this, and how does this work in this context. So that those really key discussions are vital to then allow future collaborations to take place.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges, isn't it, of doing interdisciplinary work, is realising that the words you use aren't interpreted in the same way as other people from different disciplines might use those words, and that's only really discoverable through kind of sustained conversation, isn't it, in the way that you're describing. You can really unpack different disciplinary perspectives on the theme.
Definitely.
Let us know, what about you? What benefits did it bring in the moment for you and sort of wider network?
So some very practical early benefits was the development of a pretty large bibliography and sort of a live document of writing in multiple languages around some of these themes. It also, which then became the germination of the first year and a half of the research network, which was heavily a reading and works in progress seminar, in the sense that we met, especially the first year, nearly every week, having read a core set of texts and contended with them. And I can talk about some of the detractions of that, but I think it was sort of a humbling exercise as well to say, actually, this is an old conversation. We're just coming at it from a slightly different, at a different moment, obviously, but a slightly different perspective. But it's an older conversation in the sense that also that it's one that, in particular, archivists and artists have dealt with, and archaeologists, and medievalists, and folks working in a much larger timeline than we think about, which is really 19th and 20th century and 21st century histories and literatures, etc. So it gave us, so that first kind of research that we did amongst ourselves gave us a sense of scope and scale that felt very important and very particular. So that's when we also, for example, decided we're only going to work on the Middle East and South Asia. We will think about other things and other readings, of course, but it's through the work that we know as well, and know a little bit more intimately, and then drawing from other places. So that's, in addition to what you were saying, that was one of the key kind of beginning sort of moments for us.
Thank you. James, what about you?
Similar points. Working at CRASSH and having the regularity of that program was extremely useful. A lot of our events followed a fairly straightforward format. They were a sort of seminar lecture type format where we would have a speaker in and they'd speak for about 45 minutes and then there'd be a lot of questions after that. So they'd end up running for about an hour and a half. And that was kind of the format that we kept to, but each sort of iteration we would also build in a sort of slightly larger symposium where we'd have 3 speakers really trying to unpack a theme. And I thought those symposium type events were really valuable and really important. And I think you could see the value of having that regularity because we had accumulated the right kind of language and we'd accumulated a lot of reference points. And you could see the cross-referencing emerging. And I really thought that we were actually getting to what we were trying to achieve in some of those more accumulative sessions. And I think that only really came as a result of having the regularity of that program. So I agree with the other speakers here that intellectually, in terms of our own kind of pedagogy, if you like, that the routine, the program, the structure of it was incredibly important. Just going back to kind of the origins of it, it also shifted us into another way of thinking and a more productive way of thinking and a more productive way of actually doing the work of research that the group was meant to be doing. Because in the earlier phase of the period, we'd done a sort of film screening that we had a series of speakers linked to. That was great. We'd done the conferences. They were great. Both of those took quite a lot of work to pull together. And they were all of those events in what we referred to as sort of phase 1 of the project were all extremely well attended and they're very successful. But there was a kind of big build-up of a lot of work, great event, and then it would sort of dissipate. You'd have a day of conversations and then it would disappear, right? When we moved into phase 2, which was the research networks at CRASSH, you could curate that sequence with more specificity. You could be a lot more targeted in who you wanted to get along and get involved in the group. It wasn't just going to be, a 20-minute talk which may hit the spot or not, which you sometimes get in a kind of conference type situation. When you would have a speaker along, they could speak for longer. The engagements would be closer and more detailed. You wouldn't really have the amount of time to actually think about the topic and think about what the speaker's bringing along in that conference type environment, which is very much a sort of bang, get everybody in, everyone talks, and then you kind of, so, if you're an organiser of that, I spent both of those days just running around, making sure everything was working, or trying to solve it when it didn't, work. But the regularity of the research network made for a lot more detailed conversations. The support of CRASSH was also absolutely brilliant because it's given you a platform, it's given you an all-purpose platform, and it's given you a point of reference. Something that we encountered slightly is because of the nature of the work that we were doing, and the nature of the work they were engaging with, which we kind of expected this going into it, but there was hostility is perhaps not the right word, but there was a sort of territorial suspicion, let's put it that way. From certain quarters there was kind of like, who do you think you are? working on this, sort of barging into this, which of course we weren't trying to do at all. But there was a little bit, sometimes there was a little bit of smoothing over that we had to do, and there was a little bit of kind of outreach that we had to do. And we found it actually very useful to say, well, come and talk to us. You know, here is a spot. Come and talk to us. Let's think through. Let's think through these, you know, these different perspectives. Let's think through your form of practice. Let's think through our form of practice. And they became actually kind of valuable, really valuable sessions. You know, I'm kind of overemphasizing when I say it's kind of hostility. It wasn't a kind of like, you know, sort of duelist at dawn or anything like that. But you could sometimes feel the way that one sector and one zone of practice, the academic zone, was beginning to push against a very different sector and a very different zone of practice, and they don't always gel together. You know, working here at CRASSH and having that regularity and having that kind of structure to it actually made it gel. And we were able to achieve what we wanted to achieve in that particular phase, and we were able to have the conversations that we wanted that wouldn't really have been possible in a conference type situation.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're also interested in what did this all lead to for you, the afterlives, if you like, of your CRASSH research networks. Can you just tell us a little bit about what came out of them? This could be publications, different forms of collaboration, other outcomes, other events or programs that it's led to, anything that you feel has germinated in that research network that you were able to lead on to afterwards. Mesna, should we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think there's several scales of what has emerged. So I think at the level of our own thinking and our own scholarship, it has been an incredible journey of clarity, inspiration, collaboration in various ways. I've spoken at multiple conferences about Archives Have Disappeared as a research network. We have a mailing list now of upwards of 600 scholars and archivists and artists around the world. It became a really, especially during COVID, it kind of mushroomed almost overnight into this global conversation, especially across the global south, of people who are hungry and sharing similar sorts of intellectual concerns and ideas and thinking. And so I still get at least once a week 2 or 3 emails saying where they found us on the CRASSH website, which is also an incredible resource to have an archive online that is more permanent than any sort of personal website we can ever make, if you know, for those or organized by a particular faculty. That still like speaks to the interdisciplinarity of the project. Anyway, we get emails. I get emails constantly asking to join the mailing list. The other is that kind of bibliography that sort of expanded, that has become, I think, for quite a few people, a starting reading list for comprehensive exams in the U.S. for PhDs. Sometimes a kind of jumping off point for other research networks around similar themes, for lay people who are interested, for archivists and artists and all sorts of folks, researchers. So that's been a really kind of, it's a nice thing for us to have offered as an actual resource, more than anything else. And in particular because it brought into the limelight some of the prominent literature, but also really obscure literature that isn't otherwise contended with, and brought it into sort of the archive of knowledge on this topic. The other, a few other things came out of it was several, hopefully, ERC applications, European Research Council applications for big projects that from each of us, well, 2 of us as co-conveners. We have a major conference in March, funded by the Cambridge Humanities Research Grant. We're really, really excited about it. It's going to bring some really prominent artists and scholars here. but also a lot of really exciting young, and not so young, early career scholars and researchers and writers. And hopefully what will emerge from that is an edited volume. We also have a special issue in the works for critical inquiry. And yeah, I think it became, those 3 years have resulted in a network and in a sort of a propulsion that has sustained itself in a much more low-key way in many ways, because it doesn't have the kind of rigor and support and structure of a weekly, bi-weekly thing, but where actually it's like phase 2, where it is about slightly bigger projects, slightly taking that conversation, that 3-year conversation, and then really seeing a particular site or particular people or a particular catastrophe and deep diving with that new toolkit that we've developed together intellectually. So yeah, we're really excited about the next phase, and we're really grateful to CRASSH for sort of really being the water and germinator of it.
Great, thank you, James.
Yeah, there's a lot of outputs that we're really pleased with. I mean, we were writing all the way through. A lot of the thinking that we were doing during the group has emerged into books, individually authored books, collaborative books. Myself and Yvonne, we were doing performances of one form or another all the way through this period. We've published the text of those in a sort of prose text collection, which we're really kind of pleased with. We were, because of the platform that we had, we developed a certain level of publicity before that. We were in the Guardian a couple of times leading up to coming up to CRASSH. But it really, being at CRASSH gave us that kind of base and that platform, that home, and certainly during it we were doing talks and appearing at events elsewhere. We did an event at the British Museum. We got invited to do something at the British Film Institute. Things with various film festivals, which really kind of closed the loop on some things that we were really interested in doing. So there's all kinds of things that came out of it, and I think if you speak to anyone who's interested in this, you should really, take all of those opportunities to do that and really use it for to raise your profile, and do think about being kind of future focused, impact focused, and externally facing. But in terms of the afterlife, we're now in what we refer to as our kind of third phase of it. We had this first phase, which was very kind of specific, and we thought about CRASSH as our phase 2, and we're now into phase 3, which is a phase of consolidation and collaboration, and really trying to use these contacts that we established during the time that we're working here to work into another kind of pathway. And we're working with Arts University Plymouth and Arts University Bournemouth. The people and the contacts we got there are contacts that we actually got out of the alchemical landscape here at CRASSH. And the collaborative project that we're working on between them is called the Inner Space Exploration Unit. And it's a sort of artistic and collaborative group which is really thinking about the idea of cultivating and exploring an imaginative landscape, and the processes and the politics involved in that. And again, we've had a series of events, conference appearances, exhibitions, publications linked to that. So the alchemical landscape is, it's certainly not disappeared. It is part of that. It's feeding directly into that project, which all the members of that are feeding from their perspective. So again, that's very much what we wanted. We wanted this kind of exploratory first phase, a sort of public research second phase, and then doing something with the results of what we actually found there. Something collaborative, something practice-based, and that's precisely what's taken place in that afterlife.
Great. Jeffy.
Well, this all sounds great. So with the incentive energy policy, I should have mentioned it before the seminars, we used to record a short video, sort of a 5-minute snippet with the main speaker, which we then put on our website as a resource, so people who couldn't attend the talk could at least get a flavour of what the discussion of the main speaker was going to be. So that's a resource available online. I'd say the main output was a book that was compiled and edited by Mark Ozawa, who is a research fellow at the Judge Business School, and that took the format of using the themes and topics of the seminars as a chapter for this book, looking at the issues raised and sort of the lessons learned, and so these covered topics such as the post-Fukushima relationship to nuclear energy in Japan, to the Pope's Laudato Si encyclical around the Earth as a shared resource, to the geopolitics of oil and gas pipelines in Ukraine and Russia. So very, very broad and varied, but again, looking at these from an interdisciplinary perspective. And the book was launched at the British Academy at the end of 2019, and I just had a look online, and there seemed to be over 18,000 views of the abstract. So hopefully it's being seen by the right people. And the book is actually an ideal calling card, so when we have meetings with policy fellows or government civil servants that come looking for expertise, then it's a really valuable document and resource to share with these people who hopefully are using it in their policy making roles. Other follow-up was, so we also applied for some funding from the Isaac Newton Trust for supporting some small interdisciplinary grants for early career researchers. So these were sort of seed funding amounts for 2 or more researchers from 2 or more different departments to put together a bid, and some of these projects were looking at doing some field work or accessing the data archive or attending conferences overseas. So I think some of the participants who attended the seminars made use of this opportunity. So again, it was a good opportunity to really establish some of those relationships and further some of those ideas that came out. So I say those are the main outputs, but I think there's always the intangible outputs that are very hard to quantify and to capture, which I think are equally valuable, but we just don't have the data to share. But I think, again, just bringing people together and having really interesting discussions is really valuable, and a place like Cambridge should be encouraging those types of ideas.
Great, really inspiring to hear about, I guess the breadth of those tangible and intangible benefits that the networks went on to have, those afterlives. We have in the room, I know, some existing conveners of research networks and people who are interested in applying for ones, and it seemed a good idea to tap into the vast wealth of experience that we've got on this panel, and to ask you if you could give some advice to both sets of people. So firstly, let's start with existing network conveners. Any guidance, advice, inspiration that you would like to pass on to them, things that they could be doing now or looking to the future? James, you want to start?
Yeah, I think beats time limited, really. I think about it as what you're doing as a discrete entity, and make sure that there's something of an end point connected to what you're doing. And I think that links to what I was saying before about being targeted and being very specific in terms of what you want to achieve. You have a sort of window of time to do this. I think a resource like this should in some ways be a revolving door. It should be self-generating, that, and there's always another group coming through, and that's exactly the way it should be. So in order to get your group as productive as possible, you need to be thinking very carefully about what you can actually achieve and what you want to achieve in a relatively small window of time. What we very, very, very much wanted to avoid, and what we've always tried to sort of steer well clear of, is the kind of things that sometimes you have in academic conferences when it's sort of like, you know, the 25th annual conference of whatever. And there's always that plenary session of where are we now, right? And the answer to that question is usually nowhere, or I don't know where we are because this has just gone on and we don't really know where we're going or what we're really achieving. We're just drifting off into the darkness of knowledge. But I think a research network specifically can help you avoid that. And I think you can be a lot more specific and a lot more productive if you think, what can we realistically achieve in this particular time frame? And sort of, when do we want to get to the point where we want to move on to something else? And I think having that hinge point in mind can really focus your mind in terms of what you actually want to do with the time and the resources, and thus get the entire enterprise a lot more productive. So it actually does go on to something, you know, so it doesn't sort of come to an end, and then you've got to then work hard to get the momentum up. The momentum is already there because you know where you're going, and you're using the group to actually effectively fuel the next phase of the project that you are working on.
So for current networks, I'd say it's really important to spend a bit of time thinking about how you generate impact from your activities. So it could be, you know, a blog, it could be videos, it could be an online archive or resource. So thinking about it at the beginning is always better than at the end thinking, oh, we've got all this material, what do we do with it? So I think that's always a good piece of advice.
Absolutely, and there are a lot of opportunities. I think they've been mentioned already. Ways in which CRASSH can help support that, you know, through generating blogs, YouTube videos, etc., to help you kind of build that archive that is outward facing, you know, as you're suggesting.
Yes, I share all those pieces of advice, but also to kind of pay attention to yourselves as co-conveners, and the labor distribution amongst yourselves, and to think to remain open to change and not feel too stuck on a program that you've predetermined, but nimble enough to change, pivot, see where the conversation goes. Allow yourself some structure, but also quite a bit of flexibility, which then will allow people to sort of feel a little bit more open to thinking experimentally, working, sort of exploring, deep diving, rabbit holing in productive ways, and then you can pull up someone out from that rabbit hole if need be. But yeah, just to kind of see it as a living organism in a way, the research network, rather than a predetermined program that you then meet the outputs for, and that requires from everyone who is co-convening alongside you a lot of communication. So be ready to have a lot of conversations amongst yourselves more than anyone else, and clarity amongst yourselves about goals, what you'd like to do, how you would want to take it, what direction you might want to take it. Yeah, there's a lot of negotiation when you have 4 academics or 4 anybody's trying to work together and organize together.
Thank you. And then thinking about people who are at the start of that journey, wanting to apply for a research network, what kind of advice would you give those people? James?
Yeah, I think about what you want. Think about what you can bring to CRASSH, but also think about what, in some ways, what CRASSH is for. And I think what CRASSH does extremely well and exceptionally well, and what it's always done very well, and what I think it's certainly its current iteration is doing excellently well. It's the ideal sort of third space. It's the super productive centre of the Venn diagram, and it should be that space of exploration that can't really exist in any one department. So if you're getting together with your collaborators and you've got an idea which is intellectually fabulous, but it could take place in one of your 2 departments in the context of either an existing seminar sequence, or there is the possibility to, say, meet in one of your 2 departments every week to discuss a kind of reading group. Well, there's your platform for it already. You know, what can what can CRASH actually offer to you that the departments cannot? And I think you need to be thinking about it in terms of that. What CRASH makes possible is these interdisciplinary collaborations that sort of can't really exist elsewhere, you know. And there's not just that sense of cultivating a discourse, but actually it spatially, materially, just in terms of habit, just in terms of routine, it is allowing people to come together. That kind of space and opportunity doesn't really exist elsewhere. So that needs to be kind of your criteria for sort of, you know, who you're working with, how you're pitching the idea, the kind of idea that can come up. If it's a sort of reading group on a theme, right, which is quite disciplinary specific, but you've got someone else involved who's kind of curious about that, your department is probably going to be able to horse that in some form, or you could probably make a fairly confident pitch to your department for something like that. I think a pitch to CRASH has got to be thinking about that intersectionality, about that kind of interstitial nature of this particular department and what it's really brilliant at supporting and cultivating, and think about it in those terms.
Great, thank you, Shafi.
So for new CRASH members, I'd say it's really vital to find really engaged co-conveners who have the time to put in to make running the network a success, because you forget how much energy, time, thinking space is required. So how we approached it was having a broader base of 20 or so co-conveners, but actually it did allow then for us to find those that were available and had the bandwidth for any particular activity. So I'd say think maybe broader than just necessarily the specific niche topic initially, because I think having more co-conveners is sometimes helpful. But that was just in our case. It might not be necessarily in all cases, but definitely don't underestimate the time it takes to run these networks. But on the other hand, they are amazing, so it's really rewarding as well. So it's a balance.
I think one thing that I was just thinking alongside, these are really helpful recommendations, is to have a sense of what you want to do that is, ask big questions, but not faddish questions, I guess, in a sense of be okay with being old-fashioned and old school. And it's sort of means that I think the central piece of what you want to do is a question rather than a sort of an affirmation of a theory in a certain kind of way, or a sort of inward-looking buttressing of something that is already sort of in the world or in the zeitgeist in a certain kind of way. I think okay, so this is what I'm going to say. There's a profound power in being part of a CRASH network because of the independence it offers you beyond the certain empires that get built up within different faculties. That you can, as a junior scholar, think and germinate and build something out of your own sense of what is important, out of your own sense of what is urgent, what you find interesting and powerful, and doing it alongside multi-level kind of co-conveners, early career scholars, postgraduates, senior scholars, people from outside the university, practitioners, etc., etc. So I just take really hold on to that independence and hold on to the ability of CRASH to support you in buttressing and building up that sort of independence of thought, because that'll really kind of give you the sort of intellectual power or fuel to think on your own terms and on the terms of your site and your experience and your reading and your scholarship, rather than being a sort of an auxiliary to whatever else is happening within different faculties and intellectual empires being built elsewhere.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add to a couple of things that you were bringing out there, which I thought was really valuable advice. A good place to start if you're thinking about applying for a CRASSH network is to look at the archive of research networks that we have on the website, just to see what people have done before. Huge range of possibilities, but don't use those as a blueprint, in the sense that it's your voice, your independent ideas that really need to come through. And a little bit picking up on what James was saying, we're really wanting to promote at CRASSH research that is very innovative in the kind of practices that it's involved in. So if you've got a slightly crazy idea for a research network that is going to be asking a lot of questions and bringing together different kinds of practice perhaps, or different perspectives, and you just don't even know if it's going to work, that's fine. We like risk, we like being in that space, and the third space that James was referring to, where actually this CRASSH is the only place that this could perhaps be done. And we want to support you in taking those risks and supporting you. Hopefully they'll succeed, maybe they won't, but it's really important to try doing new ways, I guess, of doing research, of collaborating, of having conversations. So yeah, do look at past networks for inspiration, but yours, hopefully, by the time that you've developed the proposal, could look really very different, and that's also very welcome. I think we're going to open up now to questions. If you have any questions or comments, obviously we've got people in the room who are currently leading networks themselves. You might also want to contribute from your perspectives, but let's also tap into the experience that there is here if anybody's got any questions.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned about pivoting in Agile. Like, how much did you kind of worry that what you came up with in the end wasn't necessarily exactly what you said you were going to set out to do?
Not at all. Because I think that's why it's helpful when it's a question. So it's open like that, right? It's like we didn't have an end. We actually desperately wanted answers, and so it wasn't this thing where we had an end goal and we were doing the plugging in to get to some sort of answer that we predetermined. It was very much a risk for us to sort of articulate this in a certain kind of way. You know, when we were starting out in 2017 and 2016, I mean, yes, this conversation was happening in all these different spaces that we were discovering in new ways, but it wasn't being asked in a way that was challenging our disciplines as they exist, right? And so part of it was, you know, being able to even articulate it was a thing for us, like, and also posit it as a problem, like, hey, we have a problem in this discipline, and here's how it works. So just, yeah, I think we thought if we had many different answers, or partial answers, or suggestions, then we were happy. And I think the thing that I think made us really happy is that there were side projects, that there were offshoots where people took this project and started up a research network on revolutionary papers. So revolution as a sort of a moment, a catastrophic moment, as it were. Or I know there's a couple of PhD students here who finished up and they got ERCs for a project that came through the conversations and reading groups. And so partly also it was putting on the table a question and then seeing where people, you know, where each of us go with it. Yeah.
If I may, just from a practical perspective, just as a kind of day-to-day curatorial perspective on that, when we were applying each year, we had a sort of draft of the events that we actually wanted to run. You know, some of those people turned out to be not available, or changed their mind in terms of what they wanted to do. And so during the actual course of running the program, we had to change what we were going to put on. We had to change the nature of the events. I think that's just an inevitable and to be expected part of running that on a weekly basis. Some people, would agree to it, and some just wouldn't be able to make it, wouldn't be available. It would sometimes change what they actually wanted to say. So that just comes with the type of platform that it is, and those shifts and turns are not necessarily a problem. I don't really think you are sort of bound into putting on a very specific event if you are effectively proposing it a number of months in advance.
I have two kind of questions. The first one is about the global scope. So it seems to me that every one of you really developed in a very global understanding. How much was it global at the beginning, or how much should it be global at the beginning? And also the second question is about time. So it seems to me that everything really developed on multiple times. But I don't know, I am a PhD student, so I'm not sure how much time I will actually have to develop this for multiple years. So how does this feature in the way you think about the network, or like, do you think it's possible if you have a year or 2 years, or you don't know exactly? Yeah, thanks.
Well, I mean, just to answer your first question, I guess, a research network doesn't have to be multiple years. Ours were, but a research network can last 1 year, right? And it could be as intensive or as unintensive as you think will deal with what it is that you have it to do, I imagine. So the labor of it is determined by what you want to do, and of course other things with your co-conveners in practical terms. I think I should say in terms of globality, a lot of these kinds of thematic conversations, of course, have resonance all over the world in many different ways and iterations. But I think specificity is really important too, because sometimes what we've experienced is that abstraction can do its own kind of not so productive work of not forcing contention with this sort of, pardon my historical empiricism, but like there is this thing where people start floating out into theoretical constructions that are very hard to pin down in order to do this global thing and bring everything in. Whereas I think thinking of specific sites or specific themes or something concrete can propel a conversation a lot more productively. And this isn't to say that you can't think internationally, right? But it's to say, well, okay, well, what specific places and people are you thinking about actually? And what are your co-conveners thinking about? And seeing if there's something shared. Is there a regionalism involved? Are there particular dynamics that are so different that it actually is worthwhile to unpack them rather than to have this kind of slightly thin comparativist approach that is often becomes the case with these claims to the global. I'm just a little wary of too many claims to the global because sometimes it masks more than it reveals. And also constructs like the global south. I don't often understand what that means or what it's meaning in a project. So to just sort of be a little bit more specific, if not in your question, at the very least in your remit of what you want to do in practical terms, etc. But sometimes I have to say, like, some of our readings were certainly not that. They were from all over, but also that we often would invite speakers or folks who were doing work elsewhere in order to sort of place that pressure on a literature that we felt began to feel during our readings, it seems a little too complacent. And then what would this pressure from an outside perspective and an outside set of practices help us to just make a different analytical cut so we're seeing it a little differently. So we were always suspicious when we were a little too comfortable with what the literature or where our conversation was going. We're like, why are we in consensus like this? It feels weird. So yeah.
Anything?
So for us, I think an international dimension to the energy transition is really key to understand. So we really wanted to explore issues around lithium mining in South America, to charcoal use in Uganda, to heat pumps in Scandinavia, because there are a lot of issues and also lessons that we can learn here, and or even just understand why things are different in different geographical locations. So for us, it was quite key to have that international dimension, and we also had some speakers from international universities come, and that's another thing I wanted to mention. Having the CRASSH sort of cachet is really important as well when you're trying to invite some high-profile speakers. So I think that's a big plus. And so I think also, Cambridge academics and researchers respond differently when you have an international or panelists from outside of Cambridge. I think there's a different dynamic as well, which in some cases works to your advantage. So I'd say it's definitely worth considering, but again, it's not worth shoehorning if the questions aren't right for your network.
James, you got anything?
Well, I agree with the two previous statements on the global scope, be guided by the question. I think where the questions that your particular question is actually taking you intellectually and, if you like, symbolically and metaphorically. But if I may actually just pick up on your second point about time, you are if you are thinking about this as a PhD student, obviously you're moving from one pressurized time zone and time scale, and then thinking about how that might apply to another. Well, as the point was made, I think we've all had fairly extensive projects, but they don't have to be 3-year projects from the get-go. It might be more realistic for you to think about 3 terms, what you could achieve over that time frame. And I think from a PhD perspective, how would that benefit the development of your own project to have that particular focus over 3 terms? And I could see that working within a PhD remit, where if you could have a question which is specific to your ongoing work, you could break that down quite elegantly and quite productively in terms of, well, here's going to, we'll spend the term doing the reading for this particular idea, we'll develop it over the course of this next term, and there'll be some kind of output in that third. I think that could work quite well. But obviously it depends where you actually are in the PhD, but it could work in sync with it, I think, quite well if you think carefully and strategically and tactically about it. Just in general, in terms of approaching a kind of time frame for this, I think another sort of practical point to consider for anyone interested in this is also think about the flow and the energy of each term in terms of the Cambridge academic calendar. I think Michaelmas is always quite an energetic time. Everyone's back and interested and raring to go, full of enthusiasm. And then there's a sort of spectrum of that, and energy sort of wanes and dissipates. I think you're going to get more of an audience for a kind of weekly seminar, kind of guest speaker type thing over the course of the first two terms, less so over the course of Easter. Certainly if you are opening it out and trying to get a crowd from across undergraduates and postgraduates and so on and so forth, I think we certainly found that this might just be a case of just when you do it during the day. We were doing our events early evening, and we found that the Easter term was always a better time to do the kind of reading group type thing, to have film screenings, where we found that early Michaelmas and early Lent were better for our high profile speakers. That we tried to sort of start each of those terms with a kind of headliner, as it were, and had the rest of the speakers sort of programmed sort of in response to that. So we would try to sort of set off a particular conversation, a particular thing with a bit of a bang, and use that as a kind of anchorage for the rest of it. But I think there's a lot of scope within the sort of experimentalism, within the kind of remit of thinking about taking a risk. Within all of that, just think about the ebbs and flows of the academic year in terms of where the energy is, where the emphasis is, where the kind of excitement is, and try to factor that into your proposed calendar.
Sounds like good advice. Just to add on in terms of the timing, so CRASSH research networks run initially for 1 year. You can, if you wish, apply for a further year for renewal, but there's no pressure on you to do that. What's interesting is that some networks run for multiple years but with different conveners, because different people then come forth to take it on. So we've got Benny with us from the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, and that's a year, and that's a network that has run for multiple years, but with different groups of co-conveners each year.
Yeah, we've got a second generation already.
Yes, yeah.
We're both retiring soon. We have new campaigners coming forward, so
Yes.
it's nice continuity.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So sometimes the network can become so successful that actually it has a life of its own that kind of continues past your initial involvement, which is great to see. Yes.
Yeah, I know this is a great space for the conversations evolving into something you couldn't have predicted. But when you think back, what the outputs were, what the impacts were, and I should touch on the intangibles. Did you build in how you might try and capture some of these intangibles, or what, how to convey some of this? It's not an easy one, but how did you go about thinking about some of these to try and to show what you've achieved at the end, because it's not easy, I understand.
I mean, oh sorry.
No, no.
So there's a couple pieces of that. I think we thought of the program itself as an archive. It certainly feels like that from emails that I get, that the sort of the structure of the 3 years has been beneficial to many people. We still have all of the readings in a Dropbox that I offer on a informal basis to folks. So there's the materials there. There's recordings. So a lot of the public lectures were recorded and they're on the CRASSH website. So that's what I mean by having a repository like CRASSH as also an archive of this work that is outside your hands and somebody else is taking care of it and Judith is there filming, or is really important because of the ephemeralness of so much of these conversations. But I think, given the topic of our conversation, we are okay with things disappearing. And that things have a way and an afterlife that is not sometimes ours to predict. They can move in memory and experience and people's feelings about a space that we organize. I mean, I have to say, be ready if you're organizing a conversation around a question that people will have feelings in the room, and it might get tense actually. And I don't know if we want to record those kinds of things necessarily, but people have memories of something that's stuck with them or stuck in their craw, processing it with everyone, that sort of thing. And so I think we were generally pretty okay with the ephemeralness of the work in that way, and that the output will emerge through an accumulation of experience as much as recording everything or putting something on paper. Because also some conversations do not need to be on the record, especially given certain topics and the certain kinds of people that are invited in spaces. We had one conversation, very often we had a subsection of conversations called documentation and disappearance, where we were inviting missing persons campaigners to speak. It was too embarrassing even to say, hey, can we record this? It's just not going to happen, right? Or former political prisoners who were speaking about how they recorded or how they thought about their experiences in prison as people who are disappeared, quite literally, right? Into a desert prison camp or something, or Guantanamo. So it really depends on the project and the network and the kinds of things and questions you're asking, and also being comfortable with the idea that research will always have pieces of it that are left in memory, and that's okay.
I think also that some of these things will work and some of them won't. Some talks will be perhaps not as productive as you hoped, right? But the things that don't work can also be kind of intangibly useful in the sense that they're indicating a direction perhaps that you don't want to go in. But they then place more emphasis on what you found useful from something else. So I agree that not everything needs to be recorded and documented, although there's lots of potentiality for archiving and archiving the work you've done. I think that's important. I think there needs to be a display of the organisation that you've done, the things that have been put on, because you should be able to document that work and that labour in some way. Another way of just thinking about the use value of it might be to think about, that this I suppose comes back to sort of targeting and being tactical and strategic in terms of your thinking. Just be aware of the range of possible outputs that you could get from this. So if you put an event on and you invite a speaker along, think carefully about why you actually want why you want to hear from that speaker in terms of your engagement, why you want them to actually participate in the conversation. If you are seeing it as a form of public research, how is that research feeding in exactly to your own thinking? That's to say, are you thinking about a conference paper that you might then wish to develop as a result of engaging with this particular material? Are you thinking about an article? Are you thinking about another kind of output? So you can get quite a lot of use value out of it by thinking carefully about the range of different outputs that you can get. But even something that perhaps is not hitting the spot, or perhaps not as interesting or as useful as you first thought it was, or something that is perhaps not as sparky or as resonant, it can indicate to you the need to go elsewhere, the need to look elsewhere, and that is a productive shift.
Can I just add one more thing? I think what's really also powerful about applying for and hopefully, knock on wood, winning research network funding is that, especially if you're an early career scholar or a PhD student, you get a really good, solid lesson on how to organize research events, but also thinking through very clearly the ethics of and practices of what it means to organize research events. Issues like consent, issues like disability and access, issues like space and how you think about them and organize them. What does it mean to have a round table? What does it mean to have a lecture style? All of those things you're building on the experience of Esther and Judith and Joanna, like all sorts of people here. So there is, it's not just about like cooking up something in your brain, meeting a bunch of folks. No, there are actually ethical ways of doing scholarship and ethical ways of organizing research events that are not perhaps commonsensical, actually. They're counterintuitive in some ways. I honestly forget them, particularly issues of access. This university is not great on access, but this building is pretty damn decent. So you have to, these are things that are really important to think about. The very idea of asking an invited speaker about their access issues, for example. I'm hung up on access because of an experience now that I'm facing around this issue, but also consent. So part of this is like, actually, if you want to record anything, you have to have the consent of everyone in the room, right? For very real reasons. And so, yeah, I think part of this is also, and to go back to your question as being a PhD student, think of those three terms in terms of what you want to get out of them, but also that you will be learning a lot about, and this is a skill for life. And I think the PhD program is so short and so tight that actually having an opportunity to do something like this systemically is a really great skill set to have, whether you go on to academia or not.
Thank you. I think we may have time for one more question if there is one. If not, I'm going to... Oh, yes, go on. Sorry.
No,
go ahead.
I wanted to ask about maybe a little bit of a practical question. So, how to get people to know that your network exists? Because usually they're new and so no one knows about it. And I don't know, I think we get tons of emails about different events. So how do you go about advertising your network and getting people to actually come and participate?
Great question. It's always, there's an embarrassment of riches at Cambridge in terms of stuff that's on. The reality of it is you will be competing with lots of other seminars. And you'll see this if you take your speakers out for dinner afterwards, that Tuesday tends to be seminar night, and there's all kinds of places that are full up of sometimes friendly, sometimes awkward tables of academics post seminar. So that's just part of the fabric of the university, and there's a lot on. So you do have to think carefully about your promotion. CRASSH has got a very well-oiled machine, and it's very good in terms of generating the materials that you need. It has a kind of an existing mailing list that its own existing network of promotion. In addition to that, we started to send our materials out to the sort of cross-section of faculties that were sort of representing what we thought was the general interdisciplinary scope of the project as a whole, and then we might also be a little bit more targeted with particular events, doing a big push for those things that we had in mind as the kind of the sort of anchor events, if you like. Extending out slightly in terms of events that we thought were a little bit more public focused. We might be again a little bit more targeted, a little bit more strategic with the promotion that we had in mind, and then also getting together that kind of rolling promotion, in touch with people, trying to identify your core group. That if you've got a set of people who are coming every time, we certainly found that the attendance we would have people who would come for one specific event because they wanted to see that, and then we wouldn't see them again. That's perfectly fine. We'd get a lot of people outside of Cambridge, outside the university, who would be coming along to certain events that they wanted to see. But we also had a kind of core group who would come every week. So our sort of contact and our promotion was sort of, at the very least, in two directions. We were trying to foster that core network and keeping in touch with those. But we were also trying to advertise as broad as we possibly could. But you might also want to think about effectively like a comms strategy as well. You don't want to be sending out emails all the time. You might want to think about a very specific time in the week in which you send out your emails to your departmental contact. So it's not like you're spamming people all the time. Because you want people, when that email arrives, you want people to think, well, what are they doing, rather than delete. I can't be bothered with it. So just you think carefully. You might want to then think about the rhythm of emails that are connected to your own department. When you get the attention, when you don't. But the kind of attention that you want to get, and also try to do a little bit of work in terms of who are the most useful points of contact in the departments that you're engaged with. Who's the graduate secretary, the undergraduate secretary? It's the departmental coordinator. Because sometimes you can send these along and they sort of get to the department, but they also get lost. Who's the person who is actually the person you should be contacted to talk about?
And these are all things that Judith, as our communications manager at CRASSH, can help advise on. And also Esther's got so many years of experience in running net research networks, so they're available to help support you in doing that. Anyone anything to add to that at all?
So definitely through your convenors as well, because they'll have access to different mailing lists, and also organisations like the interdisciplinary research centres, through Centre for Science and Policy in our case. So if you identify which are the sort of other centres or institutes that would be of interest, we also kept a list of attendees, and again emailing them the term card so that they have all the dates and seminar details. So again focusing on core group. As you say, John, there is like so many events going on, so it is you're competing with a lot of other activities, but I think it is important to make sure you try and maybe do individual targeted emails to people that you think should be attending or would be of interest to invite. So as long as you have sort of a critical mass of people, it should be good.
Great.
Just one quick tip also is that if you're thinking about more outward facing stuff, is definitely think about developing a database of inviting folks from outside the university, globally, different centers that may perhaps have similar interests. But also, one thing that CRASSH can help with is also having an event for the Cambridge Festival of Ideas, which is, we found an incredible way to also do a fun event, a public-facing event that brings people into a conversation, but in a way that feels more approachable, at least for general public. So, you know, we've had one on Syrian cassette tapes and things like that. And so it's that's really drawn a lot of viewers and a lot of interest from a general public that suddenly becomes curious about these sets of questions.
Great. Thank you huge amounts to our speakers for giving up their time and telling us all about their experience today. Thank you all for coming along. If you are interested in applying for a research network for next year, the competition will open at some point in January, and the deadline will be early May. So you've got plenty of time still to be thinking, to be contacting people. Do come and talk to us if there's anything that you would like to hear more about. But otherwise, good luck with those applications. And yeah, thank you all for coming on today.
Thank you.